Okay, for the sake of the recording, we are in Deuteronomy chapter 11 this morning. You can see from the board that we are in what is the general stipulations of the covenant, namely God's exhortation to Israel that you must obey me, you must be faithful. And in chapter 12 and onwards, we get into some more specific laws. Don't worship idols, eat these particular foods, case-by-case type laws, that kind of thing. That's really actually the bulk of the book. I'm going to try to finish chapter 11 this morning, and maybe even get into chapter 12. We'll see. That might be just over ambitious for us. I'm going to pick up in chapter 11, the concluding section from last one. You shall therefore love the Lord your God and always keep His charge, His statutes, His ordinances, and His commandments. Know this day that I am not speaking with your sons who have not known and who have not seen the discipline of the Lord your God, His greatness, His mighty hand, and His outstretched arm, and His signs and His works which He did in the midst of Egypt to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and to all his land, and what He did to Egypt's army, to its horses and its chariots, when He made the water of the Red Sea to engulf them while they were pursuing you. The Lord completely destroyed them. And what He did to you in the wilderness until you came to this place. And what He did to Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, the son of Reuben, when the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them, and their households, their tents, and every living thing that followed them among all Israel. But your own eyes have seen all the great work of the Lord which He did. You shall therefore keep every commandment which I am commanding you today, so that you may be strong and go in and possess the land into which you are about to cross to possess it, so that you may prolong your days on the land which the Lord swore to your fathers to give to them and to their descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey. For the land into which you are entering to possess it is not like the land of Egypt from which you came, where you used to sow your seed and water it with your foot like a vegetable garden. But the land into which you are about to cross to possess it is a land of hills and valleys, drinks water from the rain of heaven. A land for which the Lord your God cares. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it, from the beginning even to the end of the year. It shall come about, if you listen obediently to my commandments, which I am commanding you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve Him with all your heart and all your soul, that He will give the rain for your land in its season, the early and late rain, that you may gather in your grain and your new wine and your oil. He will give grass in your fields for your cattle. You will eat and be satisfied. Beware that your hearts are not deceived, and that you do not turn away and serve other gods and worship them, or the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and He will shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain, and the ground will not yield its fruit, and you will perish quickly from the good land which the Lord is giving you. You shall therefore impress these words of mine on your heart and on your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall teach them to your sons, talking of them when you sit in your house, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, so that your days and the days of your sons may be multiplied on the land which the Lord swore to your fathers to give them, as long as the heavens remain above the earth. For if you are careful to keep all this commandment which I am commanding you to do, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all His ways, and hold fast to Him, then the Lord will drive out all these nations from before you, and you will dispossess nations greater and mightier than you. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads shall be yours. Your border will be from the wilderness to Lebanon, from the river Euphrates, as far as the western sea. No man will be able to stand before you. The Lord your God will lay the dread of you and the fear of you on all the land on which you set foot, as He has spoken to you. See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing if you listen to the commandments of the Lord your God, which I am commanding you today, and the curse if you do not listen to the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way which I am commanding you today, by following other gods which you have not known. It shall come about, when the Lord your God brings you into the land where you are entering to possess it, that you shall place the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. Are they not across the Jordan, west of the way, toward the sunset, in the land of the Canaanites who live in the Arabah, opposite Gilgal, beside the oaks of Moreh? For you are about to cross the Jordan to go in to possess the land which the Lord your God is giving to you. You shall possess it and live in it. You shall be careful to do all the statutes and the judgments which I am setting before you today. All right, now there's quite a few things we could talk about there. That first section, the first 7 verses of that chapter, what would you say the main point of that was? Know this day I am not speaking with your sons, I am speaking with you. Your eyes have seen this. What's the point of bringing that up?
Pay attention.
Pay attention, all right?
I guess maybe
All right. Now, but what? Yes, Gail.
This is the proof. What is the proof that he's going to bring you?
Okay, so his past actions are a basis for the fulfillment of his future promises, right? But why would this point have been necessary? They seem to keep, yeah, exactly. Hasn't Deuteronomy spent how much space, how much time talking about failures of past generations? Failure to enter the promised land, building of a golden calf, the rebellion. He brings up a couple more instances here: Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab. Mark.
In Jesus' day, they said, if things had been done in our day that were done back then, we would have believed.
No, you wouldn't.
Jesus said, no, you wouldn't have. You would have been just like your fathers. And we look back at these things today and we say, if we had been Jews, we would have done better. No, we wouldn't have. We're all knuckleheads. We all have to have it drilled right into our skull, and that's what God's doing.
And that I think is a good point to bring out. That there's a tendency, to sit back in our pew or our armchair and kind of go, I would never behave the way that these sinful people in the Bible would have behaved. But it's a very self-righteous approach to it when you think about it, because we're human like they are, and we have the same weaknesses that they did. We have the same temptations that they did. When Paul says that no temptation has overtaken you except which is common to man in 1 Corinthians 10:13, he's not just making some generic statement about, God never gives us more than we can handle. His point, if you look in the context, is talking about the rebellions of Israel. And he's saying you're no different than they are. And if they fell away, so can you. But they had the option of escape, and so do you. That's the point when Paul says that in 1 Corinthians 10. And it's the same thing here. Responsibility cannot be shifted for your sins to another generation. You can't blame the past generation for messing everything up, and you can't blame the future generation for also messing everything up. No, responsibility belongs to those who are alive and hearing the Word of God right now. And that goes for every single one of us here. He mentions God's acts of power, the plagues, the Exodus, the Red Sea, the wilderness, and the provisions they received in it. He also mentions Dathan and Abiram, another demonstration of God's power, but also of His punishment to those who rebel against Him. The earth swallowed them up, devoured them alive. They descended alive in Sheol in Numbers 16. There's kind of we're not going to go in depth with a lot of this chapter because a bulk of this chapter is summarizing a lot of things we've already looked at so far in Deuteronomy. And just from reading this chapter, what do you notice that we've seen before? If you can remember everything else we covered in Deuteronomy so far. Any phrases jump out at you? Any concepts sound familiar?
Reminds him he's giving them the land.
Oh, okay, that's a big one. There's an emphasis on the future conquest of the land. God's going to drive out these nations from before you. He's going to give this land to you. He's been saying that since the beginning of Deuteronomy, and kind of re-summarizes it here. What else? Gail? Teach these things to your children. Have we seen that before? Yes, we have. Chapter 6. Write them on the doorposts. Write them on your hands and on your foreheads. Talk about it constantly in the home. When you go out, when you come in. The Word of God is supposed to be a topic of regular conversation in the home. What else? Anything else?
He gives them the land, but then they must prolong, stay in the land, not faithful.
Oh. So they can't keep the land if they just, take it for granted. They have to be faithful. They have to not forget. There was a bunch of warnings in chapter 8 against the concept of forgetting, in your prosperity, forgetting in the testing that you went through in the wilderness and all that brought you up to this point. What else? I don't have a specific number I'm looking for, by the way. I'm just asking if you're noticing things. There's a lot.
And there's a challenge with the pagans. That's where they're going. It's going to be a challenge.
Right.
Because there's a temptation to go along.
Okay, so there's a warning against the pagans in the land and the problems of their idolatry, everything else. Israel's told to obey God so they can receive their free gift, showing the interrelationship. This kind of shows a little bit the relationship between divine grace and human obedience. Because on the one hand, well, the land is God's free gift. Israel didn't do anything to earn that. On the other hand, that free gift can be taken away from them if they so rebel against Him. People want to act like, grace and works are somehow, diametrically opposed to each other, and they're not. You see it. If you had said that to somebody in ancient Israel, they would have looked at you like, "What are you talking about?" There's no conflict between those. Our Western mindset wants to see that conflict, but that's not the case in the biblical writer's thinking. Gail.
Well, on that line, now
Well, yeah.
specific instructions.
Exactly. I mean, the land's not going to take itself, but it's still a free gift. Israel by themselves could not take this land. That's the thing that's crucial to understand, is that the guys living in the land are too powerful for them. Israel's not the most powerful nation in the world. They're the least of the nations. They were slaves in Egypt. They're not going anywhere, but by the power of God, they do go somewhere. And they are presented with this opportunity, and they are presented with this blessing, and God gives them the land. And yet they must take the land. It's told that the land is not like Egypt. Egypt didn't have regular rainfall, but they had the Nile River, and that was the lifeblood of their land. Instead, what Egypt required was hard work and irrigation. You water the vegetable garden with your foot, that kind of thing. But Canaan actually gets a rainfall. God cares for that land. His eyes are always on that land. Does this remind you of anything? A land that God cares for and waters regularly. Does this sound like anything we've seen elsewhere in the Bible? Eden! Sounds like the Garden of Eden, doesn't it? And there's a sense in which, and I'm not saying this is exactly the return to the paradise from Genesis 2, it's not. But there is a sense in which the promised land is part of this key process that God is going through to return man to this lost paradise, to return man to this fellowship that He had with Him in the Garden of Eden. Canaan serves as a type of that. Similarly, it serves as a type of heaven to come. And on top of all that, there's a condition here. Just like in Eden, so is the case now. You can stay in Eden as long as you obey God's rule. But if you break it, well, then you will surely die. You will surely be removed from that garden. You will surely be removed from that prosperity. And verses 13 through 17 give kind of a miniature blessings and curses. If you listen to my commandments, then God will give you rain, and He will bless you, and you'll have crops. You'll have all this other stuff. But if you disobey God, if you serve other gods, well, then God will shut the heavens up and there will be no rain, the ground will not yield its fruit, and you will quickly perish from the good land. You will surely die. Sounds a lot like what God said to Adam and Eve.
Obedience had to be prompted by love for God. Verse 22. Kind of way about, well, the Old Testament's just do, keep, obey. But He wanted the heart, the spirit, the soul, the mind, the strength, the whole man, the whole person involved in those acts of obedience. It wasn't just going through ceremonialism, ritualism. There was a love for God that was the basis and the motivation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I've been trying to emphasize in this class, is that the Old Testament is not just about the mechanics. It's not just about the particulars and the rituals. I mean, what's the central command on which all others hang? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. And God wanted the hearts of His people. In chapter 10 and verse 16, He said, circumcise your hearts to the Lord and stiffen your neck no longer. God's always wanted the hearts of His people. The fundamental difference between the Old Covenant and the New one is not whether or not God wanted the hearts of His people. The difference is whether or not it's a reality. Under the Old Covenant, well, they had to be taught, know the Lord. But under the New Covenant, they know the Lord from the least to the greatest of them. He possesses their heart. The law actually is written on their hearts and their minds. He puts a new spirit and a new heart within them. And so, what was a declared ideal under the Old Covenant becomes a reality under the New Covenant in Jesus. And the way that God does that is He gives us the ultimate motivation through Jesus Christ. And the sacrificial act of His crucifixion. That's a whole number of lessons we could probably get out of that, but that's a good point to continue to bring out. It's not about just the mechanics here. Even in the law, the law has a lot of do's and don'ts in it, but those do's and don'ts need to be understood in the context of a larger relationship that God has with Israel. And just like any parent who loves their children first and foremost, still makes rules for their children, well, the same thing is true of God and Israel. God, why would a parent make rules for their children? Well, it's not because they don't love them, it's because they do love them. And because they want their children to love them back. And they want their children to meet their potential and not destroy themselves. Such is the case with God. God makes rules for us, not because He wants us to jump through, the ring of fire, or, He wants to see how much it takes to break us. No! He makes the rules for us because He loves us. Because He gives us good statutes by which, if we do them, we may live. That's the point that God is trying to get across to Israel this whole time. He calls them in verses 18 through 21 to impress these words of mine on your heart and on your soul. That's just a restatement of what he said earlier. Not only must the word be on the hearts, it must be taught to the children. It must be the topic of regular conversation. It must be written on the door frames. If the only conversations you're having about God and His Word are within the confines of a building like this, then maybe we're missing something here. Maybe we're missing something in our family life. That needs to be a topic of regular conversation in the home, constantly. He describes in verses 22 through 25 the future conquest. If Israel keeps the commands, God will drive out their enemies. Every place they tread will be theirs. No one can stand before them. And in verses 26 and onward, He gives them a fundamental choice. And what is that choice? What is the main choice at the end of this chapter? Blessing or curse? Life or death? In case the blessing and curse wasn't specific enough for them, it's life and death is what we're choosing between here. He offers the same choice in chapter 30 in verses 19 and 20. There's evidence actually that a lot of what happens in chapters 4 through 11 is parallel to what happens in chapters 27 through 30. But I guess we could talk about that a little bit more later when we get down to that. The blessings and the curses, in connection with that, he describes a special ceremony that they're supposed to have. The blessing is on Mount Gerizim, the curse is on Mount Ebal. These were two mountains that were located right in the middle of Israel, and I regrettably don't have a map. If I did, or if I attempted to draw a map, it would not be very good or accurate to scale. But let me give you a for instance, okay? Whenever Jesus, in John 4, goes into Samaria, and he goes to the village called Sychar, and he sits down at the well of Jacob, and he meets the woman at the well in John 4. They're sitting right between those two mountains. And when she says, well, our fathers worshipped in this mountain, she's pointing to Mount Gerizim. The reason why is because of a way that the Samaritan Pentateuch had altered a section of Deuteronomy to say that Gerizim was the place they should worship. So what happened? That's where Jesus was. He was standing between these two mountains when he asked the woman at the well for a drink. The emphasis on this whole section, and the emphasis in this whole book, is on the choice we make. And they were to have this regular ceremony, which the details are given a little bit more in chapter 27, where half of Israel would stand on Mount Gerizim, half of Israel would stand on Mount Ebal, and they would recite blessings and curses. We were joking before class about how it was like a game of Marco Polo, blessing, curse. God. And what happens here, these two mountains serve as permanent monuments to Israel's choice. They're not going to go anywhere. They're not going to be torn down by anybody. They're going to sit there on either side of the city of Shechem. And to give you another point of reference, at the end of the book of Joshua, in Joshua 24, Joshua gives a speech to them very similar to this one, where he says, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. Verse 14 of Joshua 24, therefore fear the Lord and serve Him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. If it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are now living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. But this whole conversation is taking place, guess where? At Shechem, right between those two mountains. What's probably happening here is they're having a blessing and curse discussion here. And Joshua tells them once again, make a choice. Choose to serve God or to serve the idols. Choose the blessing or the curse. Choose life or death. But it's your choice. This is fundamentally the most important choice. In some ways, the only real choice you make in your life is whether you will obey God or disobey God. Whether you will submit to Him or whether you will rebel against Him. Whether you will love Him or whether you will hate Him. There is no middle ground. There is no third option, if you will. That's the choice we have. And with these verses, the general exhortation to covenant loyalty is ended in chapter 11. Be careful to observe all these statutes. Now, there's a lot more we probably could have talked about, but does anybody else have a comment or a question they want to throw in before we move on? No? All right. Well, chapter 12 onward, from chapters 12 through 26, we're not going to cover it all in one day. It's not going to happen. It's very, very long, and it's a list of specific stipulations, specific laws. And, we talked about how it's not about the mechanics, and it's not. But the mechanics are nevertheless right there in the middle of the book, and they are there for a reason, because God is explaining to them how they should live. I'm not going to give a really detailed outline of those chapters because it's kind of tricky. Some people say it's random. Some people try to coordinate the whole section with the Ten Commandments, which you get some really funny parallels when you do that. You get some that are interesting, but some that's like food laws and don't take the name of God in vain. That doesn't really quite square up with each other. Now, more likely, the Ten Commandments are the basis for everything we read in these chapters, though. I'll give you that. The ancient peoples probably wouldn't have seen the need for the clear-cut linear outline that we're looking at here. And we need to read it on its own terms. And while there, I think, is a general sequential movement from commandment number 1 about only one God, no idols, to commandment number 10, no coveting, there does seem to be a way in which they kind of alternate back and forth. And there's no rule stating that, this law in Deuteronomy corresponds to this of the 10 commandments, commandment number 5 or commandment number 6 or whatever. Well, sometimes they can apply to both, or 2 or 3. For instance, we learn in chapter 22 that he describes rape. Well, that's a sexual sense. That's like adultery, but it's also like murder, he says. So it's both. Kidnapping, was that murder or is that stealing? Well, it's both. He talks about a man stealing his neighbor, literally. Then he also talks about how you get the death penalty for that because you destroyed his life, is what you've done. You basically killed him. And there's all sorts of things like that throughout. So, but chapter 12 is primarily focused on the place of worship. So I'm going to read chapter 12 and make some comments on that. These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall carefully observe in the land which the Lord your God of your fathers has given to you, to possess as long as you live on the earth. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars and burn their asherim with fire, and you shall cut down the engraved images of their gods and obliterate their name from that place. You shall not act like this toward the Lord your God. But you shall seek the Lord at the place which the Lord your God will choose from all your tribes, to establish His name there for His dwelling, and there you shall come. Therefore you shall bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the contribution of your hand, your votive offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. There also you and your household shall eat before the Lord your God, and rejoice in all your undertakings in which the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall not do at all what we are doing here today, every man doing what is right in his own eyes. For you have not as yet come to the resting place and the inheritance which the Lord your God is giving you. When you cross the Jordan and live in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, He gives you rest from all your enemies around you so that you live in security. Then it shall come about that the place in which the Lord your God will choose for His name to dwell, there you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the contribution of your hand, and all your choice votive offerings which you will vow to the Lord, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levite who is within your gates, since he has no portion or inheritance with you. Be careful that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every cultic place you see, but in the place which the Lord your God chooses in one of your tribes. There you shall offer your burnt offerings. There you shall do all that I command you. However, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your gates, whatever you desire, according to the blessing of the Lord your God which He has given you. The unclean and the clean may eat of it, as of the gazelle and the deer. Only you shall not eat the blood. You are to pour it out on the ground like water. You are not allowed to eat within your gates the tithe of your grain or new wine or oil, or the firstborn of your herd or flock, or any of your votive offerings which you vow, or your free will offerings, or the contribution of your hand. But you shall eat them before the Lord your God in the place which the Lord your God will choose. You and your son and your daughter and your male and female servants and the Levite who is within your gates, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God in all your undertakings. Be careful that you do not forsake the Levite as long as you are in the land. When the Lord your God extends your border as He has promised you, and you say, I will eat meat because you desire to eat meat, then you may eat meat, whatever you desire. If the place where the Lord your God chooses to put His name is too far from you, you may slaughter of your herd and flock which the Lord has given you, as I've commanded you, and you may eat within your gates, whatever you desire. Just as a gazelle or a deer is eaten, so you will eat it. The clean and the unclean alike may eat of it. Only be sure not to eat the blood, for the blood is the life, and you shall not eat the life with the flesh. You shall not eat it, you shall pour it out on the ground like water. You shall not eat it so that it may be well with you and your sons after you, for you will be doing what is right in the sight of the Lord. Only your holy things which you may have, and your votive offerings you shall take, and go to the place which the Lord chooses, and offer your burnt offerings, the flesh, and the blood on the altar of the Lord your God. And the blood of your sacrifices shall be poured out of the altar of the Lord your God, and you shall eat the flesh. Be careful to listen to all these words which I command you, so that it may be well with you, and your sons after you forever. For you will be doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. When the Lord your God cuts off before you the nations which you are going in to dispossess, and you dispossess them and dwell in the land, beware that you are not ensnared to follow them after they are destroyed before you. That you do not inquire after their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods, that I may also do likewise? You shall not behave thus toward the Lord your God. For every abominable act which the Lord hears, or what the Lord hates, they have done for their gods, for they have even burned their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. Whatever I command you, you shall be careful to do. You shall not add to, nor take away from it. All right, now, one question come up. Chapter 12 does kind of go kind of its own distinct unit here. But you notice anything about the way it begins and ends? What does he tell them? Warn them against.
To follow His rules and exactly.
Okay, yeah, that's right. That's in there. And what else? There's another element in that, more specifically. Observing the...
Observe and obey.
Observe, obey.
Are you looking for be careful?
No, that's not.
In both the opening and the closing.
He does say that. You're right.
Carefully observe, and then in the end, be
No, we're looking at verse 1 and verse 32.
Yeah.
All of your answers are right. Okay, so...
What is your question?
the thing I was actually looking for...
More specific.
Verses 1 through 4, verses 29 through 30. Yes, destroy, thank you.
Okay.
Y'all were right, I just worded the question poorly. So that's one of those situations. Yes, he contrasts the worship of the pagans with the worship of Yahweh. You will utterly destroy their high places and their altars, verses 1 through 4. And in verses 29 through 32, warns against the dangers of being seduced by these Canaanite religions. It's the same concept. But all of that is intrinsic to obeying what God has said. Don't add to it, don't take away from it, don't pick and choose what you want to do. You must obliterate the names of these pagan gods, verse 3, contrasted with the fact that God establishes His name and His sanctuary in verses 5, 11, and 21, because He has the name above every name. Now, what would you say this chapter is about, mainly, if you could sum it up to one thing? Okay, he's prepared the people to go into the land.
Keep their focus on God and not be distracted by all of the gods around them.
Okay.
There's a specific place that God will put His name, and focus there. And
Yeah. And that's the idea there is that throughout this chapter there's an emphasis on the place which the Lord your God chooses. The place of worship. And God must be worshipped. He can't be worshipped just anywhere. He has to be worshipped at the place He chooses His name to dwell. And who chooses that place? God chooses it, not man. And it's not a question of when or where, but who. Now, when they enter the promised land, they set up the tabernacle at Shiloh. Now, there was nothing inherently special about Shiloh. It's just a place. But what made it significant was the fact that God chose that place to make His name dwell. And the same thing is true in Jerusalem, the city that God has chosen. It's called that numerous times throughout the historical books. But what was it that made Jerusalem special? Was it anything magic about the city or the hill that it was on? No, it was the fact that God chose that place to build His temple. Now, implicitly, this forbids building high places. That was something very popular. Even in the days of David and Solomon, they would build high places to worship God at. And they just worship God anywhere they pleased. And God said, you can't do that. You worship God at this location, this sanctuary. Now, I alluded to this earlier. The Samaritans had a version of Deuteronomy that made it so that the place God chose was Mount Gerizim. And that was where they demanded they worshipped. That was not right. The correct answer to that was Jerusalem. And that's why Jesus and the Samaritan woman had that conversation. You people say that in Jerusalem is the place where we ought to worship. But our fathers worshiped in this mountain. So which is it? Well, in Israel's history, God dwells at Shiloh for a while. He eventually chooses Jerusalem. But then Jesus says what? What does Jesus have to say about the place of worship?
We worship that which we know, but the time is coming and now is when in neither mountain shall you worship God, but you will worship God in the Spirit.
Worship God in spirit and truth. And I want to correct a misconception that's out there about this. In spirit and truth is typically interpreted to mean, we're talking about sincerity and correctness. And it's not to say that God doesn't want sincerity in worship. He's always wanted that. Joshua 24:14, fear the Lord and serve Him in sincerity and truth. But Jesus is talking about something that's going to change, and His emphasis is on the place of worship. And I would say then that in spirit and truth kind of hints at this idea that wherever God's people are is where His name dwells. Wherever the Spirit of the Lord is, that is where He is worshipped. The rest of the Old Testament hints at this idea a little bit, that is there really a physical edifice on earth that can contain God? No, there's not.
Solomon said that at his dedicatory speech at the temple. The temple was built, it was in his prayer.
Right.
No building can contain you.
Heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. Right. 1 Kings 8:27. Isaiah 66. Heaven is my throne. Earth is my footstool. Where then is the house that you would build for me? The Lord says. Stephen makes this point in Acts 7. The temple's not adequate. So what is the temple? Well, worship is no longer restricted to a physical temple or a physical priesthood and physical sacrifices. It is now in spirit in a way that was not before. And this is, when we talk about the temple, where's the temple today? Well, we are the temple. As a people, the people are a temple. It is built of, as Peter describes it in 1 Peter 2, living stones into a spiritual house to offer up spiritual sacrifices. This building that you've got over your head, this is just a structure. This can be torn down, can be destroyed, can be repossessed. Any number of things could happen to it. But if this building ceased to exist, this church would not cease to exist. That's the crucial thing. We don't want to put our stake or investment in a physical edifice. We want to put our stake in the spiritual people of God, in God Himself. The mistake that the Jews had was putting, they equated the presence of their physical building with, their spirituality. They would say, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. No, the Lord can come and destroy your temple, Jeremiah says. The same thing is true with us. If we put our confidence in something like a building, well, the building has no significance whatsoever, I would say. And, I think it's a mistake for Christians to try to invest a significance in the building that is simply not there. Worship is not restricted to a physical temple because we are the temple of God. It is not restricted to animal sacrifices because we are the living sacrifices, Romans 12:1. It is not restricted to a physical priesthood because we are a royal priesthood, a holy race, a chosen nation. 1 Peter 2 and verse 9. So that we may proclaim the excellencies of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. Now that's a mouthful and a whole sermon by itself, but that's something to think about. Mark.
Put it in a nutshell, I guess we could say here, God is telling them, look, you're not going to worship me according to the ways that men worship me. You're going to worship me in the place and the way that I want you to worship me. Mm-hmm. Now, what Jesus tells the woman at the well is the exact same thing. There's going to be a change coming. You're not going to worship God the way you want to worship Him and where you want to worship Him. You're going to worship Him where He wants you to worship Him.
Right. And God has never willy-nilly permitted people to do whatever they wanted. That's just not, and in fact, that's what He says here. You don't do what's right in your own eyes. You don't just do whatever you feel like. You do what God says. There is a change coming for Israel too. You shall not do all that we are doing here today, every man doing what is right in his own eyes. No, you go your way, I'll go mine. I've met people before who acted like the situation in the days of the judges where everybody did what was right in his own eyes. Oh, that was a good thing. We need to go back to that. No, we don't. That's a terrible thing. That was the worst. That was Israel's darkest time period. Have you read Judges 19 and 20 and 21 and tell me that was a good thing? No! Judges 21, 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Well, the problem wasn't the lack of a human king. The problem was that they were not recognizing God as king, really. They were rejecting God as king. And when they said to Samuel, give us a king, like that's going to solve their problems, God says the same thing. He says that their problem is that they have rejected me from being king over them. That's the human tendency. Whenever Jesus stood on trial before Pilate, what did they say? They said, we have no king but Caesar. They rejected God as king even then. We'd rather have the human king. We'd rather have the human solution to the problem. We'd rather do what was right in our own eyes. But of course, the law explicitly says that people are not to do this. We cannot behave simply as we please. We cannot live simply as we want to. Because we do not have rights even over our own bodies. The Lord has purchased that for Himself. Has purchased that with His blood. We are but clay in the hands of an almighty potter who makes us as he sees fit. Well, there's a lot more that we can say about all of that, and not enough time to get into it. So I'm going to go.
One quick thing in conclusion.
Sure.
When the explanation is given, and I've had this cast in my teeth when I explain spirit and in truth and context that it exists. People say, well, then you're saying we don't have to worship God according to His Word. Not at all. No. Worshiping God in truth, real worship involves worshiping Him according to His Word. It's just that there is a deeper meaning to that than merely we worship Him with our heart and we worship Him according to His Word.
Right, and it's a little bit of a nuanced way of understanding the passage. But, once you understand the background to everything that Jesus is actually conversing with her about, which means you had to have read Deuteronomy at some point. See how important Deuteronomy is? Everybody acts like Deuteronomy is, lost and forsaken book. But really, it adds so much to our understanding. Jesus quotes this book so much, or alludes to it so much, that it's just kind of hard to throw it out and say it's not necessary to know this. Gail.
Sincerity and accuracy.
Well, that's not true at all. Yeah, that's not true at all.
It has to mean something.
Yeah, Joshua 24:14, fear the Lord and worship Him in sincerity and truth. That seems pretty straightforward. Jesus might even be alluding to that. Who knows? But, Joshua wanted sincerity. But, no, God never cared. Well, and true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and truth. Well, that doesn't mean that the worship in the past was false worship. It just means that, that was, a model or a type, like the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched. Well, the one on earth wasn't the true tabernacle, but that didn't make it a fake one. It just meant, because God had commanded it, made it a model of the tabernacle in heaven is what it did. And on and on and on we could go. This is really its own lesson, but I appreciate the comments and the discussion, and we will pick up next week where we left off in chapter 12.